in rural New England. When I was 12, I began going to a Jewish summer camp in Pennsylvania. Though I had met Jewish people from outside my hometown in rural Vermont before, at camp I realized for the first time that my Jewish childhood out in the sticks was different from the other campers who had grown up in large urban Jewish communities. Not only had my Jewish experience been different, it was as though my identity as a Jewish person was adjusted to fit the place I had grown up. This year I decided to find out whether that difference was felt by other Jews living here in rural New England. I've always known there was something unique about living here in the Northeast Kingdom, just because it's a special place. But is there something different about being Jewish here as well? Before investigating, I needed to know whether this topic had already been explored. I searched for studies of Jewish identity and found a plethora exploring Jewish identity among a representative sample of the American Jewish population. But as I learned from Sachs et al., 80% of all Jews in the United States live in just the 40 largest metropolitan areas. With such prevalence of urban Jews in nationally representative studies of Judaism, the identity of rural Jews did not receive any significant attention in such studies, except for one, conducted by Alper and Olson in 2013. This study concluded that the importance of Jewish identity to individual Jews tends to be higher in areas where Jews accounted for a small proportion of the population, when controlling for sect. Yet Alper and Olson focused on less Jewish regions across the United States, not New England specifically. What about regionally focused studies? I found a number of interesting sources on New England Judaism, all of them focused on small-town Jews, the rural population that I was interested in. However, they do not focus on Jewish identity, but on various aspects of it: history, culture, and response to anti-Semitism in the case of these studies. A study of holistic Jewish identity in rural New England seemed to be a logical next step. Given that there is significant literature regarding Jewish identity in America, but that the studies of Judaism in rural New England did not focus on Jewish identity as a whole, I posed the question, how does locality inform Jewish identity for self-identified Jews of rural New England within the context of the American Jewish identity? Now, by this point, I've thrown around the term Jewish identity so much that I really can't go on without figuring out what it is. Well, all those studies that I mentioned previously, the nationally representative ones that overrepresented urban Jews, they all basically considered identity the same way. They broke it down into two or more elements, like religion, culture, and ethnicity. This makes sense. As Phillips pointed out in 2010, many American Jews don't practice Judaism in a religious manner. So in order to understand how these people identify with Judaism, we need to be able to measure the aspects of Judaism that they identify with, for example, their heritage. Once aspects are defined, they are broken into a bunch of other measurable pieces. Those little icons that I put beside religion, culture, and ethnicity are kind of representative of that. And these little pieces are all measurable and can be analyzed with questions like, do you eat foods specific to Judaism? Or they pertain to religious practice, as in the question, do you study Jewish liturgical texts like the Torah? So based on this interpretation of Jewish identity, you take measurements of a lot of little bits and pieces of Jewish life, which, when you add them up, gives you a numerical value for Jewish religious identity, or Jewish cultural identity, or Jewish ethnic identity. For quantitative studies like that of Fulton et al. In 2024, who studied what factors strengthen the American Jewish identity, a very measurable question, that approach makes sense. Most national studies of American Judaism have used this approach as well. These studies are based upon surveys, a method of study which, according to Navarro, Rivera, and Cosman, yields results that are easy to compare to surveys of different populations. To ensure that my results could be placed in the context of American Judaism, I decided to use a survey as well. But I didn't just want to know whether various aspects of rural New England Judaism were more or less prevalent than in American Judaism. I wanted to know what, if anything, about rural New England Judaism causes that discrepancy. An article published by Cohen in 2000 had some advice. Cohen suggested long interviews provide the stories that exemplify and lend depth to particular attitudes and experiences, page 14. Interviews were already used by Hoberman in 2008 to study Jewish culture in rural New England, and by Sweeney in 2020 to study how New England Jews cope with anti-Semitism. There was existing precedent for using interviews to study rural New England Judaism, and the interviews had the potential to offer deeper insight into my survey results. I decided to incorporate interviews and surveys into a mixed-mode methodology to answer my research question. I started with a survey containing 53 basic measurable bits and pieces of Judaism, which I selected from the methodologies of Friedlander et al., Hartman and Sheskin, and Alper and Olson, a number of nationally representative surveys. Participants could select which of these factors were part of their life. I ultimately, unfortunately, needed to discard almost half of these factors because of various complications with responses. Of the 23 which I kept, I categorized them as pertaining to either religion or culture. I calculated how many factors, on average, participants selected in each of those groups to measure religious and cultural components of Jewish identity. The survey also contained demographic metrics, which measured the variables I have shown on the screen. I organized participants into groups based on their responses to these metrics, then conducted t-tests or linear regressions as appropriate, using demographics as independent variables, and religious or cultural identity measurements as dependent variables. I sent this survey to every synagogue and Jewish organization in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont that was located in a county considered by the New England Rural Health Association to be rural. Shown here, if the laser pointer will work. Well, they're shown in green, so you can see them very easily. You can see from this map that while most counties in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont are considered rural, most counties in the states of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut are considered non-rural, not necessarily urban, but non-rural. Because none of these states was considered majority rural, I chose to exclude them entirely from my study. Sorry to all the urban Jews who were excluded. I don't care if you live in Boston or Burlington. You just aren't the people I'm studying. In the pre-survey consent form, I asked participants to verify that they didn't live in any of the non-rural counties of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, shown here in purple. And you can see that those are basically just the counties that contain the largest cities like Portland, Maine, Manchester, New Hampshire, and Burlington, Vermont. When my survey peaked at 89 results, 64 of which had answered all questions and were usable, I compared a selection of 12 of the factors I had been able to keep to results from the Pew Research Center's report, Jewish Americans in 2020, to see if rural New England had any impact. This report by the Pew Center was not focused on Jewish identity specifically, but on a massive array of variables that it analyzed, and which happened to include factors that I had used to measure various aspects of Jewish identity. Comparing the percentages of respondents who had selected various factors showed that rural New England Jews were more engaged with both religious and cultural activities than the average American Jew. And as you can see from this graph, really the only way that the average American Jew exceeds the average New England Jew in terms of any kind of practice, cultural or religious, is in Holocaust remembrance over there in the left-hand column. But by and large, we do see that the Jews that I sampled from tend to be far more religiously and culturally involved than the American average. How is it that rural New England Jews tend to be more religiously and culturally connected than the norm for Jews in America? Well, part of it is that I initially sent out the survey to synagogues and Jewish organizations. Jews get involved in these hubs of community to access religious and cultural resources. So a whole population of New England Jews had far less access to my survey. Those who identify as Jewish by heritage, but not religiously or culturally. This is a major limitation of my research, and one that future researchers could address by taking a large random sample of the New England population, as was used to compile the national dataset analyzed by Hartman and Sheskin in 2012. Oversampling affiliated Jews skewed my data in favor of religious and cultural Judaism, part of the reason for those higher percentages shown on the graphs. But another reason for the higher than average results in these categories was revealed by my interviews. To conduct interviews, I reached out by phone, Google Meet, and in person to people who had expressed interest at the end of the survey. First, I had these participants give consent, and then I interviewed them. I used the semi-structured interview recommended by Cohen, starting by asking participants how rural New England impacted their Jewish identity, and then letting the conversation develop. I recorded interviews and generated transcripts using the iPhone Voice Memos app, and I initially aimed for 16 interviews, the same number that Sweeney received in 2020. However, due to limited time, I only received 14 interviews that I could use. I analyzed the transcripts of these interviews thematically using a similar method to Sweeney. I found 27 themes initially, but these 11 are most relevant to the above-average religious and cultural participation of rural New England Jews. And now we're going to explore them. Firstly, interviewees shared that the minority experience was new to them. Keep in mind that every interviewee had been born outside of rural New England. Most had grown up in areas where there was a much larger Jewish population, to the degree that being Jewish was just the normal thing to do. Some participants shared that before moving to rural New England, being Jewish was not something they had had to think about. In rural New England, being Jewish is outside the norm, and as the 14th interviewee stated, quote, "I feel the void a lot more, and therefore I'm more aware of the need to be part of a community," end quote. Community was indeed the theme most frequently referenced by participants, and many described accessing cultural and religious resources through their synagogue communities. Another finding emerged based on the themes of personal religion, personal Jewish values, and lack of access to Jewish resources. Some participants shared that the reason they had not been forced to think about their Judaism before moving to rural New England was that in the majority Jewish areas where they had lived, resources such as kosher foods and other Jews with which to pray were far more common and accessible. In rural New England, this is not the case, which led participants to adapt rituals to a more practical form. For example, the 4th interviewee participated in Torah study sessions at his synagogue instead of the formal Torah reading services, which require a minimum of 10 Jewish adults. Surprisingly to me, none of my interviewees felt that their Judaism was lacking because of adjustments they had made. Instead, they explained that adapting the rituals allowed them to closely examine ritualistic purpose and find deeper meanings. The first interviewee, for example, explained that to him the value of keeping kosher, that is, following the dietary laws of Judaism, is not about splitting hairs over which restrictions apply to which foods, but rather about general mindfulness around eating. Interviewee 1 chose not to follow the minutiae of Jewish dietary law, while other interviewees adjusted other religious and cultural practices to fit the rural New England setting. For example, my family. This is my sister during her bat mitzvah, which was broadcast via Zoom because in rural New England, communities are so spread out that it is very difficult for people to come and be in the same space together. Technologies such as Zoom are, according to strict Jewish law, not allowed on Shabbat. However, my family has chosen to make this adjustment because we believe that the meaning of my sister's bat mitzvah is important enough to be shared, and we want to preserve that. While adapting finer points of Jewish practice and ritual, yet preserving core tenets led some participants to adjust their Jewish identities, others maintained that the nature of Judaism is one of permanence, regardless of place, or, as the eighth participant put it, a portable homeland. According to this participant, the long history of Jews living in diaspora has led Judaism to, quote, sanctify time and not place, preserving the heritage through deep ties to cultural and religious history rather than location. Participant 8 affirmed that his Jewish identity had not been affected by his move to rural New England because of what he called the decoupling of Judaism and place. However, he also acknowledged that Judaism in rural New England continues a tradition of Jewish steadfastness and tenacity inherent in its minority history. Participant 8's views were shared by Participant 1 with regards to rituals such as daily prayer, which allowed him to connect with Judaism in a consistent fashion no matter where he is. The specifics of a portable homeland and the reasons some rural New England Jews choose to connect with it, while others connect with their Judaism by adjusting practices and identifying their deeper meaning, is beyond the scope of this presentation. However, they offer an interesting path for future research. Other points future researchers of regional Judaism should consider include building Jewish identity surveys on the same frameworks as nationally representative surveys to allow for broader comparisons to be drawn. I was lucky that my own survey, which I developed before even looking at the Pew Research Center's survey, contained many of the same measurable elements. I should also reiterate that my results may only be applicable to rural New England Jews affiliated with synagogues or other Jewish organizations because of my sampling methods. Other limitations included that my survey had few respondents who were raised in rural New England, so the effect of rural New England on one's Jewish upbringing could not be measured. Future researchers could take the next steps of deliberately surveying the non-affiliated Jews of rural New England, or surveying Jews who grew up here. As for the Jews of rural New England, my results are a reminder that our presence here is a continuation of a long tradition of rural Judaism, however strange it may seem. Thank you for listening to my capstone presentation, and I'm happy to take questions. Anya?
So obviously you mentioned that a lot of your survey respondents and interview respondents, if not all, were moved here. I'm wondering what your age range looked like. Was it mostly older people, or did you get a good youth sampling?
It was very much skewed in favor of older people. However, I did run t-tests on the effect of, or not t-tests, I ran linear regressions on the effect of age as it pertained to both religious and cultural Judaism, and I didn't find any correlation. It seems that people's Jewish identities was not particularly related to age. However, I do believe that sampling a younger age range would not only lead to results that are more pertinent to that generation, but also would sample the population that grew up in New England more effectively than my study. Ms. Linton?
Thank you. Did this project change your perspective on your own experience, and if so, how?
I'd say that this project kind of clarified for me something that I've always just kind of noticed, which is that when I was a kid and reading picture books about Jews in Eastern Europe, the setting always looked very familiar to me. It was, little villages, country roads connecting them, people with goats, and I had never really realized before that this is a representation of Judaism that is kind of unfamiliar to Jews from cities, and I found it interesting that it had been so confirmational of my personal childhood and my Jewish upbringing. Mr. Arain?
New England is one of the least religious parts of the United States. So I'm wondering if you considered at all the impact that the relatively a-religious nature of New England has an impact on Jewish identity here.
Kind of Puritanism to become more a-religious. I asked them whether they felt those were particularly complementary or not complementary to Judaism, and most participants expressed that they felt that at least the religious nature of New England did not have a major impact on their Judaism. However, it was interesting to me that a number of participants, of interviewees, expressed that they had been able to achieve interfaith friendships more readily in rural New England, perhaps because there are simply so few religious people here that people of any religion at all kind of gravitate towards each other. And through those interfaith friendships, participants were able to reflect on their Judaism and the nature of religion in New England in general.